Weimar Germany, November 1923. A loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks, and a lifetime of savings held in that currency buys nothing at all. An account that could have purchased a house in 1918 is enough for bread in 1923. 5 years. That's how long it took for a stable currency to become worthless paper. But some people survived. Some even came out ahead, not because they predicted the collapse, and not because they knew the date in advance, but because they followed principles that work in every collapse, regardless of the cause, the country, or the century. Argentina, 2001. The peso is frozen. Banks shut their doors. Deposits are inaccessible. Dollar accounts are seized and forcibly converted into pesos at a rigged rate. Overnight, 66% of your savings disappears. And still, some people survived. They followed the same principles used in Weimar, in Rome, in every collapse that came before. America, 2025, national debt, 36 trillion. The currency has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. The Federal Reserve created $5 trillion in 2 years. The pattern is already familiar. The system is following the same pattern that has preceded every currency collapse in history, and when the break finally comes, whether in 5 years or 15, the outcome will be decided the same way it always is, by the principles that separate survival from total loss. These are the 5 financial principles that have survived every collapse on record, not because they predict timing, but because they keep working when everything else stops. Each one is proven by history, repeated across centuries, and still applicable now, before the window closes. This isn't about getting rich, it's about not losing everything. Because in every collapse, most people do lose everything, not because they were careless or uninformed, but because they relied on tactics that function in stable systems and fail the moment those systems break. These principles worked in Rome, they worked in Weimar, they will work in America. Before the principles themselves, one distinction matters more than any other: the difference between principles and tactics. A tactic is specific advice: buy gold, sell stocks, rebalance portfolios, and it might work or it might not because it depends on timing, on the type of collapse, and on variables no one controls. A principle is different. It works regardless. Principles worked in Rome when gold was money, they worked in Weimar when paper was money, and they will work in America, whatever form the collapse takes. Whether the failure comes through hyperinflation, deflation, or a currency reset, most financial advice remains tactical. Buy this stock. Hold 60% stocks and 40% bonds. Those tactics assume the system keeps functioning. They assume banks stay solvent. Governments honor contracts. Property rights are enforced. In a collapse, those assumptions fail. The principles don't. Principle 1. Hard assets survive while paper burns. When currencies collapse, governments default, and financial systems seize up. Physical assets retain value because they exist outside the system itself. Paper assets are claims, and anything that is only a claim on something else goes to zero once that claim can no longer be enforced. Weimar Germany, 1918 to 1923. If you held 100,000 marks in a bank account in 1918, you were wealthy. By 1923, that same balance couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The currency inflated into worthlessness. Paper wealth vaporized. But people who owned hard assets survived. Land, buildings, factories. A farm in 1918 was still a farm in 1923. It grew the same food, held the same real value, and functioned the same way, even as prices moved from thousands to trillions. Zimbabwe, 2008. Hyperinflation reached 79.6 billion% per month, and savings held in local currency became worthless. But farmland, livestock, and equipment preserved wealth because the land kept producing food regardless of what happened to the currency. Argentina, 2001. Bank accounts frozen. Dollar deposits forcibly converted to pesos at a fixed rate. The peso then collapsed. Same principle. Different country, same outcome. Hard assets survive, paper burns. In America, 2025, most wealth sits in paper assets: stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, and bank deposits. And every one of them is a claim. A stock is a claim on earnings. A bond is a claim on repayment. A bank deposit is a claim on a promise. In stable times, those claims work. In a collapse, the system stops working the way people expect it to. Courts are overwhelmed, banks fail, governments default, markets freeze, and the paper claims everyone relied on stop being enforceable. Paper becomes worthless. Hard assets don't. Real estate is still real estate. Gold is still gold. A farm still produces food. That value exists independently of the financial system. When collapse comes, paper burns. Hard assets survive. That leads to principle 2. Own productive assets, not speculative ones. This principle separates assets that produce real value from assets that only exist because someone else is willing to pay more later. Productive assets generate income, food, or utility, regardless of sentiment, prices, or market belief. Speculative assets don't. They only have value if you can sell them. During the Great Depression, from 1929 to 1933, the stock market fell 89%. If you owned stocks for speculation, you lost almost everything. But if you owned productive assets directly, a farm, a rental property, a business, you still received what they produced. A farm produced food you could eat or sell. A rental property provided housing people still needed. Productive assets generate value independent of market price. A farm produces food, whether the stock market is at 381 or at 41. Speculative assets only have value if buyers exist, and in collapse, buyers disappear. Venezuela, 2010s. The stock market rose over 100,000% in nominal terms. It sounded extraordinary until you realized the currency lost 99.9% of its value. Paper gains meant nothing. But people who owned productive assets, farms, bakeries, transportation, survived relatively well. A bakery produced bread, and bread was desperately needed. The bakery created value even as the currency failed. Contrast that with Venezuelan government bonds. They only mattered if the government honored them. The government defaulted. The bonds went to zero. In America, 2025, most assets are speculative. The S&P 500 is valuable because people believe it will keep rising. Bitcoin produces nothing. It's valuable because people believe someone else will pay more later. Much of real estate is speculative, purchased to flip or appreciate. Productive assets are different. A farm that grows food is productive. A rental property owned free and clear is productive. A business that produces goods people need is productive. When collapse comes, own things that produce value. A farm feeds you. Speculation doesn't. Principle 3. Debt destroys you. In stable times, debt looks like leverage. You borrow to buy a house, prices rise, and you profit. But in collapse, all debt becomes bad debt. Income falls or disappears, while the obligation remains. The bank still demands payment. If you can't pay, they take the asset. During the Great Depression, farmers borrowed heavily throughout the 1920s as land prices rose. Borrowing made sense until 1929 arrived. Crop prices collapsed, farm income fell 50 to 70%, but the debt stayed the same. Between 1930 and 1935, more than 750,000 farms were foreclosed. Families who had owned land for generations lost everything because of debt. Compare that to farmers who owned their land free and clear. They struggled. Prices were terrible, but they survived. Without debt payments, they lived on what the farm produced. Debt-free farmers endured. Indebted farmers didn't. Argentina, 2001. Middle-class families held mortgages denominated in dollars. When the peso collapsed, peso incomes fell 66%, but mortgage payments stayed fixed in dollars. Income fell by 2/3. The debt didn't. They couldn't pay. They couldn't pay. Banks foreclosed. Homes that people had paid for over 10 or 15 years were taken anyway. Those who owned their homes free and clear kept them. Same crisis. Same income collapse. No debt meant no foreclosure. Greece, 2010s. Incomes fell 30 to 40%. Pensions were cut in half, but mortgages stayed the same. Default rates exploded. Debt finished what the crisis started. In America, 2025, household debt sits near $17 trillion, $12 trillion in mortgages, over $1 trillion in auto loans, trillions more in student debt and credit cards. When crisis comes, that debt doesn't shrink, it multiplies the damage. Millions of families will be destroyed by obligations they can no longer service. The common counter-argument is inflation. If you owe $300,000 and inflation runs at 20%, the debt shrinks in real terms. That only works if your income keeps up. In real collapses, it doesn't. The only safe position is zero debt. Assets owned free and clear. If you own a house with a mortgage, you don't own a house. You own a leveraged bet that prices stay high and your income stays stable. If you own a house free and clear, you own it. Period. No bank can take it. Debt fuels expansion in stable times. In collapse, it is suicide. Principle 4. Skills are the only truly portable wealth. Every other form of wealth can be taken. Land can be seized, gold confiscated, money inflated away, businesses nationalized. Skills remain. They exist in your mind. They can't be taxed, confiscated, or debased. The Holocaust. Jewish families owned property, businesses, savings. All of it was confiscated. But those who survived often did so because of skills. Doctors, engineers, craftsmen, people who could work. They traded labor for food. They rebuilt in new countries. The wealthy merchant with no skills starved. The skilled craftsman with nothing survived and rebuilt. Soviet Union, 1917 to 1922. Private property was seized overnight. Aristocrats with vast estates lost everything. Engineers, doctors, and skilled workers retained value. The state needed them. Their skills gave them leverage even under communism. The aristocrat with 10,000 acres who couldn't farm starved. The blacksmith with nothing but skill survived. Vietnam, 1975. When Saigon fell, millions fled. They couldn't take property. They couldn't take businesses. Those who rebuilt most successfully arrived with skills. Doctors, engineers, accountants, mechanics, they came with nothing else. Within a generation, they built stable lives. In America, 2025, most wealth is tied to financial assets and real estate. None of it is portable. If you're forced to leave, you can't take your house with you. You may not even be able to take your money once capital controls are imposed. The only guaranteed portable wealth is what's in your head. Skills move with you. Everything else stays behind. The problem is that most people have no practical skills. Can you grow food, repair machines, build shelter, provide medical care? These skills have value in every economy, stable or collapsed, because they produce something real, independent of complex systems. Skills are the foundation of rebuildable wealth. Everything else can be taken. Principle 5. Local trust networks outlast institutions. When systems collapse, institutions fail all at once. Banks close. Governments lose authority. Police stop enforcing laws. The institutional framework breaks down. Local networks don't. Soviet Union, early 1990s. The government dissolved. The currency became worthless. Pensions stopped. Supply chains collapsed. Stores were empty. People survived through local networks. Families shared resources. Neighbors traded. Communities organized security and distribution. The people who survived best weren't the wealthiest. They were the most connected. The isolated individual with money in the bank starved. The connected individual with relationships endured. Argentina, 2001. Banks closed. Neighborhood assemblies formed. People organized locally to barter, share resources, and provide security. Informal networks became more important than government. Those embedded in these networks could trade skills for food and labor for goods. Lebanon, 2019 onward. The currency lost 90% of its value. Banks closed. The government became dysfunctional, yet the country didn't descend into total chaos. Why? Because Lebanese society is built around family and religious community networks. Those networks provide what the state no longer does. Before modern institutions, all economic activity ran on trust networks. You traded with people you knew. You borrowed from people who knew you'd repay. Modern institutions scaled beyond local trust. When they fail, society reverts back to it. In America, 2025, most people are institutionally embedded but locally isolated. You have a bank account but don't know your neighbors. You rely on Walmart for food but don't know local farmers. You rely on police but don't know your community. That structure is catastrophically fragile. When institutions fail, you have no fallback. Build local networks now. Know your neighbors. Create reciprocal relationships. Embed yourself in a community. As institutional trust erodes, local trust becomes more valuable. Those with strong local networks survive. The isolated struggle. These are the 5 principles. Hard assets survive. Paper burns. Productive assets outlast speculation. Debt destroys and collapse. Skills are portable wealth. Local networks outlast institutions. Notice what isn't on the list. Which stocks to buy. Which cryptocurrency to hold. Gold versus silver. Those are tactics. The principles work regardless. They worked in Rome, they worked in Weimar, they'll work in America. And they don't require perfect timing. You don't need to know exactly when collapse arrives. You position yourself according to what survives collapse. Own hard assets instead of paper. If collapse comes in 2030 or 2040, it doesn't matter. Hard assets preserve value in both stability and crisis. Own productive assets. If the system holds, they generate income. If it breaks, they generate survival. Eliminate debt. In stable times, you gain resilience. In collapse, you endure, develop skills. In stability, they raise income. In collapse, they become your only portable wealth. Build local networks. In stability, they provide community. In collapse, they become survival infrastructure. These principles improve your life now and protect you later. The mistake most people make is waiting for certainty. They want to know exactly when collapse will arrive. But collapses don't announce themselves. By the time it's obvious, it's already too late. That's the advantage of principles. They don't require prediction. You don't guess the date. You position yourself according to what survives collapse, and you're protected regardless of timing. These 5 principles are ancient. They've survived 3,000 years because they hold across every economic system: the Roman Empire, medieval Europe, the Industrial Revolution, modern America. The principles don't change because human behavior doesn't change, and mathematics doesn't change. When debt exceeds the ability to pay, collapse follows. When currency is debased, paper wealth evaporates. When institutions fail, local networks matter. These aren't forecasts. They're patterns that have repeated hundreds of times. The American collapse will follow the same structure. The specific tactics may differ. The principles won't. Hard assets survive. Productive assets generate value. Debt destroys and collapse. Skills remain portable. Local networks outlast institutions. Position yourself according to these principles now, and you survive what's coming. Ignore them and chase tactics, and you're betting that you can time collapse perfectly. Most people lose that bet. If this showed you why principles matter more than tactics, why the same 5 principles have survived every collapse in history, and why you can act now without predicting exact timing, subscribe. The next video breaks down the tactics that fit these principles in America today. Which hard assets make sense in a digital economy? Which productive assets still generate real value? How to reduce debt strategically? Which skills matter most? How to build local networks in an isolated society? Principles tell you what to do. Tactics tell you how. These principles worked in Rome, they worked in Weimar, they worked in Argentina, they will work in America. The only question is whether you follow them before the window closes, or wish you had after it does.